Chapter 553 Execution. Shut up. One of the soldiers saw Mrs. Qui shouting non-stop, so he stepped forward and kicked her down. Mrs. Qui simply crawled on the ground and wailed louder. At the same time, she was filled with regret. She regretted helping young Shecheng do so much dirty work but was abandoned at her final moment. In fact, she ended up worse than Mrs. Gu. At least Mrs. Gu died in their residence and had a grand funeral. As for her, it would be good if young Shecheng could even bury her in a decent coffin. She even left her son with the crime of being the descendant of a sinner. If there weren't any major turns of events, it would be difficult for him to pursue an official career. Seeing this, the members of the Qui family also realized that they were out of hope this time. All of them started crying. As they cried, the murmuring below the execution platform gradually stopped. As for young Wanyu, she looked at Mrs. Qui's despairing wails and silently shed tears. Madame Qui stared at the crowd below numbly, her mind was replaying her life. When she was young, her family valued boys over girls. At a young age, she was already a good helper at home and outside. When she married a scholar from a good family, she thought she could finally live a good life. Who knew her husband would die of illness when young Shecheng was just 1 month old? Later on, she did the best she could. She finally raised young Shecheng to be a man and got him to marry a golden goose like Mrs. Gu. Her days soared into the sky. She never expected that she would end up like this. What happened? Now that she thought about it, it was all because of dissatisfaction, resentment, and greed. They wouldn't have come to this if they hadn't dabbled in the loan shark business. Listening to all kinds of complaints and curses from her family members, she ignored them. Yes, she didn't want to bother with anyone anymore. If they didn't exist, if they didn't keep asking for money, if they didn't betray her, she wouldn't have been pushed to the execution ground today. In this life, she never owed any of her family members. The only one to whom she was genuinely indebted was Mrs. Gu. Although she had snatched her imperial mandate, she had helped pave the way for her son's official career, given them a stable and wealthy life, and even left a son and a daughter for the young family. She had done everything she could for the young family, but they. At the thought of this, Madame Qui finally shed tears of regret. King An threw down a warrant and announced, "Begin the execution." As soon as the warrant landed, 8 soldiers stepped forward and grabbed the 4 youngest members of the Qui family, placing them on the gallows. Perhaps it was because they were young that their execution process was exceptionally quick. However, the agonizing struggle before death caused deep despair in everyone who was waiting for their turn. The timid ones were so terrified that they peed their pants. However, no matter their thoughts or reactions, they were still hung on the gallows. In the end, there were only 2 left, Mrs. and Madame Qui. Madame Qui was already numb to the outside world, and Mrs. Qui was on the verge of insanity. When they were placed on the gallows, Mrs. Qui saw her tearful children and the expressionless young Shecheng. She also saw young Wanning and her brother, who showed no expressions. Thinking about her children's future, she couldn't leave like this. Otherwise, young Shecheng would give up on them very soon. Therefore, she immediately shouted, "Master, Master, it's Mrs. Gu. This is all her revenge." The surrounding onlookers were stunned by her words, not knowing what she meant. This pissed off young Wanning, but simultaneously, she realized this was a golden opportunity. Just as King An was about to declare her execution, young Wanning rushed forward and said, "Wait a minute." Chapter 554 Questioning. What is it? King An looked at her unhappily. "Please let her speak. One can't let her frame my mother for no reason." Young Wanning looked at Mrs. Qui and said, "King An is here, father is here, and many others are here too. You must make yourself clear today. What did my mother do to make you try to smear her name before your death? If you don't clarify, don't even think about dying painlessly. Wanning, come down. She's your mother." Young Shecheng shouted. "She's not worthy of being my mother. I won't acknowledge a person who wants to kill me, my brother, and even try to frame my mother before she dies." Young Wanning shook her head. "Don't spout nonsense. You didn't even ask her anything. How do you know if she's talking nonsense, or maybe you know if she's telling the truth? You, The people below listened and immediately clamored to support young Wanning. All of a sudden, the voices of the people united. Their voices grew louder and louder until they reached a deafening level. When King En saw this, he immediately stood up. Taking advantage of the pause between their shouts, he roared, "Stop, all of you, stop." He approached Mrs. Kui and said, "Mrs. Kui, I'm now asking you as a judge of the Ministry of Justice. Tell me what you mean by what you said earlier." Mrs. Kui didn't know what to say. She couldn't say she dreamed that Mrs. Gu wanted to kill her, right? Wouldn't that indirectly admit that she killed Mrs. Gu? She never expected young Wanning to dare to barge onto the execution platform. Before she could say anything, young Shicheng came up and said, "Your Highness, she's just rambling before her death. Let's execute her, otherwise, it will be getting late." King En looked at young Wanning after hearing that. From her words, Mrs. Kui may have more evidence of her crimes. In addition to Mrs. Gus' relationship with King An's mother, he planned to help young Wanning out. There's no hurry. Since she spoke out, one want to get to the end of this today. I can't let my mother be framed for a groundless crime. Young Wanning looked at young Shicheng firmly. Young Shicheng glared at her, trying to indicate that she shouldn't pursue the matter any further. He wanted Mrs. Kui to refrain from speaking again. It would get him killed if Mrs. Kui couldn't take the pressure and said something she shouldn't. However, young Wanning ignored his looks and looked at Mrs. Kui. "Why? Cat got your tongue? Why aren't you saying anything?" She had to clear up any misunderstandings today. Otherwise, it would be up to everyone's imagination once Mrs. Kui was executed. Young Wanning and her brother would be in a bad position at that time. Young Wanyu was also extremely anxious, but she dared not go up on stage because she knew what young Wanning said was true. She was afraid that she would get implicated. Young Cheng Sen wanted to go up, but he was held down firmly by young Cheng Lin. Mrs. Zhao and Mrs. Ning were happy at this turn of events, but they had no intention of going upstage. King En said to an official on the right, "Record it." He then gave the two soldiers beside him a look. "Yes." The official replied and sat down at the table, preparing his stationery. The two soldiers also came forward and took young Shicheng to the side. They covered his mouth and guarded him. His struggles were useless. Mrs. Kui saw young Shicheng could no longer help and had no choice but to tell everyone about the night before the robbery in their residence and her dream of Mrs. Gu. However, she hid the fact that Mrs. Gu was coming to her for revenge. Young Wanning asked quickly, "So, you must have been frightened by my mother seeking her revenge." Chapter 555 Warning: There's no such thing. Mrs. Kui quickly denied this. However, the uneasiness in her eyes was clearly seen by King En. It seemed she may have caused Mrs. Gus' death. This meant he did not have to be polite any further. He looked at young Wanning and asked, "Do you have any evidence?" "She did harm my mother, but one don't have conclusive evidence for her murder. But one have evidence of the person who harmed me. As for corrupting my brother heard it with his ears." "I knew of this too," young Wanning said. "Did you bring your evidence?" "No, I originally intended to let go of this since she's getting executed. Since she would be executed in such a disgraceful way, for my father's sake, I didn't want to pursue the matter. But since she wanted to drag my mother's name through the mud before her death, I can't tolerate this anymore." Young Wanning wiped her tears and continued, "All my evidence and witnesses are ready for presentation anytime. Speak. One will send someone to get them." King En quickly called a team of soldiers over. Young Wanning turned around and led a group of soldiers to the side. She told them the location of her evidence and witnesses in a low voice. After the soldiers heard this, they greeted King En and quickly galloped away on their horses. Mrs. Kui was panicking at this moment. She did not expect young Wanning to have gathered witnesses and evidence of her crimes. When did she start collecting them, and how much did she collect? What should she do? "Wanning, don't forget that your surname is Yang." Madam Kui warned young Wanning. She didn't want to bother, but she spoke up when she considered young Shicheng's future. "Of course, I know my surname is Yang. But no matter what, I can't just watch my mother's name get dragged through the mud. For example, If someone claimed you murdered my grandfather, do you think my father would not care? From the moment you forced me to ask King Rui for his betrothal gifts to subsidize young Wanyu's, our relationship was over. Moreover, since we were young, you've never liked us siblings. Especially me. You never even gave me a piece of candy. You won't deny this, right? Madame Kui looked at young Waning's cold gaze and could only turn her head away and ignore her. She then gave Mrs. Kui a look. When Mrs. Kui received her gaze, her heart turned cold. However, for the sake of her two children's future, she finally compromised. As long as she refused to admit it, no one could do anything to her. These exchanges did not escape young Waning's eyes, but she ignored them. It didn't matter to her how many crimes she could convict the soon-to-be executed Mrs. Kui of because she just wanted to leave the young family. Once word got out today, not many people would believe that Mrs. Kui was innocent. Sure enough, the crowd was in an uproar. They booed Mrs. and Madame Kui and even young Shecheng. They knew it was impossible for him not to know about this happening in his household. Those who knew his background immediately spat in disdain. After all, he was a typical example of someone who relied on his in-laws to start his career. It was shameful for him to treat his first wife and two children like this. Of course, there was no shortage of gossip in the capital. In a short while, a ton of old gossip was dug up. Most of them were about stepmothers abusing stepsons, daughters bullying illegitimate children, etc. About 15 minutes later, the guards rushed over with Yang Waning's evidence and witnesses. Of course, Jiyu Chungrui and King Rui, who had been informed in advance, also rushed over. King Rui did not approach the execution ground. Instead, he stopped in an alley a distance away. After the witnesses and evidence were brought up, Yang Waning pointed at the scholar and explained loudly how Mrs. Kui and her daughter plotted against her marriage. Chapter 556. Not admitting. King An looked at the scholar and asked, "Is what Miss Yang told the truth?" The scholar pointed at a woman and said, "Yes, she is the one who came to me. She asked me to ruin Miss Yang's innocence and then marry her. However, before I could make a move, one was discovered by King Rui's convoy." Yang Waning pointed at another woman and said, "This is Mrs. Kui's personal maid, Mrs. Shen. She's the one who sent someone to put hardy ice plant in my tea leaves. Is it true?" King An looked at Mrs. Shen. Mrs. Shen looked at Ms. Kui and saw that she was staring at her. She knew she wasn't allowed to say anything, so she quickly lowered her head and pretended to be mute. King An shook his head when he saw this. He looked at the servant girl who did the dirty work and asked, "You are the one who put the hardy ice plant into her tea leaves?" "I did it, but I had no choice. Mrs. Shen captured my brother to threaten me. It doesn't matter, as you're the one who did it. You could have told your missus in advance or stopped her from drinking it after that, but you didn't do it." King An shook his head. Next was the matter of young Chenglin getting corrupted. Young Chenglin personally came up and told King An everything he had heard that day. Finally, he looked at Cheng Yang Sen and said, "Enrich, I've always treated you as my younger brother, but you treat me as your enemy. We're no longer brothers. You deserve it. Who asked you to be so stupid? You can't tell north from south after a few compliments. TSK, are you even any different? Oh my God, wealthy people are sure spoiled. They can even purposefully nurture a spoiled brat. We smaller families can't afford to do this. Money is nothing. What they want is property and status. That is something that no amount of money can buy." Exactly. Besides, he was just a child. How much could he spend? These people just have to raise him until he is too spoiled and make Lord Yang hate him. This would be enough to prevent him from inheriting the family property. Such a vicious stepmother, suppressing the two children with different methods. Most importantly, no one could say anything since she provided everything her stepson wanted. If this really succeeded, she would at most sigh and say that it was sure difficult for her to be a stepmother. She could push the blame on her away cleanly. Scheming witch. Yeah, and this will get her a good reputation at the same time. Yang Waning was not in the mood to listen to the people's gossip, so she quickly asked Mrs. Sun to explain her situation. Mrs. Sun briefly explained what happened to Ms. Jiyu. Finally, she pointed at a beggar beside her and said, "That night, the maid on duty was called Tsueya, but she disappeared the next morning. Her husband, Qiu Sheng, stopped us on our way here. Your Highness, that is indeed the case. When we were returning, this beggar named Qiu Sheng blocked our way. A soldier came up and bowed. Qiu Sheng kept shaking his head, but he couldn't make a sound. You're mute?" King An asked thoughtfully. Qiu Sheng nodded. He crawled around the ground and found a stone. He started writing on the ground with difficulty. A total of 3 short sentences explained the matter clearly. In the first sentence, Tsueya was instructed by Mrs. Shun to cut off the charcoal. The second sentence explained that they were hunted down after being released from the residence. In the third sentence, it was revealed that he was poisoned to make him mute. After he finished writing, he pointed to his throat and started crying. Seeing this, Yang Chenglin stepped forward and wanted to kick him, but Jiyu Chungrui stopped him. Now was the time to fight against a common enemy. Chapter 557. Swear. King An saw that all the evidence was focused on Mrs. Shun. He looked at Mrs. Shun and asked, "Mrs. Shun, in the face of their accusations, do you admit it?" Mrs. Shun nodded and looked like a pig waiting to be slaughtered. "Who instructed you?" "No one. Madam is my savior, so I only wanted to protect her from harm." "So, you want to take all the blame on yourself?" Yang Wanning gritted her teeth. "I did it, alone." Mrs. Shun raised her head and swept her eyes over her indifferently. Yang Wanning was furious after hearing that. She thought Mrs. Shun would speak up after seeing that Mrs. Kui was on death row. She didn't expect Mrs. Shun to protect Mrs. Kui, even if it meant her death. The relationship between this master and servant was deep. Mrs. Shun was just a widow whom her in-laws chased out. Her maiden family had disappeared because of the disaster, so she had no one related. She did not have anyone who she could be threatened with. Yang Wanning could only look to King An for help. King An also had a headache. Looking at Mrs. Shun, he knew she was unafraid of death. Or rather, she did not care about life and death anymore. It was difficult to get such a person to speak. Yang Wanning saw the difficult position she was in and was at a loss. Jiyu Chungrui happened to notice the smug look in Mrs. Kui's eyes. However, he couldn't do anything openly in public. At this moment, Ju Ying's voice suddenly sounded in his mind, "Ask her to swear to Mother God, the more deathly her oath, the better." Jiyu Chungrui was stunned by the suggestion. After he returned to his senses, he was thrilled. He had a strong backer, so there was no reason to be afraid of her not confessing. He looked at Mrs. Shun and spoke up, "Well, put a rest to this if you swear to Mother God that if you are doing this to protect Mrs. Kui, you will be a slave for 10 generations. Swear that your descendants will be slaves for generations. Swear that your family will have no descendants." After hearing this, Mrs. Shun looked at him in shock because his suggestion was vicious. This would render her unable to turn over a new leaf forever. Yang Wanning nodded in agreement and said, "Yes, everyone knows Mother God has manifested her spirit. One thinks she will have her opinion. If you swear, as my cousin said, I will believe you then." Everyone's expression changed immediately when they heard the word Mother God. Of course, most people were excited. They all wanted Mrs. Shun to take this oath. They wanted to see if Mother God would punish these villains or not. Jiyu Chungrui noticed that Mrs. Shun was staring intently at him. He glanced at her and said, "Don't feel wronged. After all, there are lives on your hands. Since you have sinned, you should be prepared to pay your debts. Yes, swear, swear. As long as you swear, we will believe that Mrs. Kui is innocent." "That's right. Hurry up and swear. We can see if Mother God will care about these things." "Swear, swear, swear." Mrs. Shun looked at the chanting crowd below and did not know what to do. King An crossed his arms and watched the show from the side. If this matter really succeeded, then it meant there would be a way to deal with even the most stubborn criminals in the future. Yang Wanning saw Mrs. Shun was finally panicking and pressed on, "Make an oath. If you dare say it, I'll believe all of this is your doing alone." Mrs. Shun gritted her teeth and glanced at Mrs. Kui. Seeing her staring at her nervously, she finally closed her eyes and said, "I, Mrs. Shun, Swear that if I protect Kui Fengji, At this point, she couldn't continue. She was afraid that if Mother God really manifested, she would never have a good life. Just as everyone was about to urge her, a bolt of lightning suddenly struck down in front of Mrs. Chen, scaring her so much that she screamed and immediately fled backwards. Chapter 558. The end of the Kui family. The others weren't any better off either. They were all frightened. This was especially true for the guilty Mrs. Kui. Her originally pale face had turned green from shock. Just as everyone was still recovering from their shock, a Lu-foot-tall phantom of the Mother God appeared in the air and slowly said, "Heaven has long arms. The good will be rewarded with good, while the evil with evil." After saying that, she gradually disappeared. King En, the first to regain his senses, immediately knelt and said, "One bid your farewell, Mother God." With his words, everyone quickly returned to their senses and immediately knelt and kowtowed. Mrs. Shun, on the other hand, had a look of despair on her face. Remembering that she had not finished her oath, she heaved a sigh of relief and kowtowed 3 times to Mrs. Kui. She then kowtowed to young Wanning and said, "I'm sorry, young miss, one was wrong. It was Mrs. Kui's instructions to poison Madam and you with the hardy ice plant, cut off Madam's charcoal, and find the scholar to frame you. As for the eldest young master, I only inquired about his whereabouts. I did not participate in anything else." At the same time, young Shicheng almost peed his pants. He never expected Mother God to show herself. Did she know what he had done? Realizing what would happen to him, his legs went weak. "Anything else?" Young Wanning looked at Mrs. Shun and asked. Without waiting for her to speak, Mrs. Zhao rushed up and questioned, "Back then, when one miscarried, was it planned by you and your mistress?" Mrs. Shun raised her head, looked at her guiltily, nodded, and replied, "Yes, back then, Madam found a kind of mint that would attract cats and rubbed it all over your clothes. It really is you. I'm going to kill you." Mrs. Zhao quickly rushed toward Mrs. Kui. She didn't reach for her neck, but she still punched her stomach a few times until she fainted. "Do you know where Mrs. Kui hardy ice plant comes from?" Young Wanning asked again. Mrs. Chen shook her head. "I'm not sure. One only know that someone sent it over. One don't know anything else." Seeing this, King En took the opportunity to interrogate Mrs. and Madam Kui again, but they refused to give any helpful information regarding young Shicheng. He made the 2 swear, but they ignored him, looking like pigs waiting for slaughter. When King En saw this, he decided it was time for their execution. He was already certain that young Shicheng must have participated in the loan shark business. However, he also knew that the emperor had other plans, so he quickly ordered their execution to start. The executioner also hated the 2 of them very much, so he deliberately slowed down his actions, causing them to suffer greatly. But this time, no one jeered. Instead, everyone was reflecting on whether they had done anything wrong. It would be troublesome if Mother God remembered that. Ultimately, Mrs. Shun and that little servant girl were exiled together. As for the beggar, Qiu Shang, he bit his tongue and committed suicide after witnessing Mrs. Kui's death. When Jiyu Chungrui saw this, he got someone to buy an ordinary coffin to bury him. After everything was over, the butler quickly arrived with the coffins and shrouds. When young Wanning and her brother saw this, they were ready to accompany Jiyu Chungrui out of there. "Stop!" Young Shicheng shouted. "We haven't collected your grandmother and mother's bodies yet. We will never admit Mrs. Kui as our mother. As for grandmother, I'm afraid she doesn't want to see us. It's better to let the person she likes collect her corpse." After young Wanning finished speaking, she pulled young Chenglin away and followed Jiyu Chungrui. "Father, look at them." Young Wanyu wanted to sow discord between them, but she was frightened by young Shicheng's cold gaze. She could only bring young Cheng Sen and the officials to collect the bodies of the Kui family. Chapter 559. Deterrence. After leaving the execution ground, Jiyu Chungrui turned to look at the siblings and asked, "What are you guys thinking? Do you want to go home with me or back to the young residence?" "Let Chenglin go home with you. I'm going back to the young residence. After so many things have happened, it's time to end it completely." Young Wanning replied, "I don't want to. Let's shoulder it together. Young Chenglin shook his head. Be obedient. If anything happens, I won't be able to protect you at all. One don't need your protection. This is our problem, so we have to face it together. Yang Wanning wanted to say something, but Jiyu Chungrui interrupted her, saying, let him go. He's already a half-grown kid. It's time for him to make his decision. I'll send someone to protect you two in secret. All right, sorry for the trouble. No worries. Remember, you can resist, but don't take the initiative to stir up trouble. I understand. Yang Wanning, her brother, and Mrs. Sun walked back together. When Jiyu Chungrui saw this, he turned around and looked for King Rui. Your Highness, the Kui family have all been executed. I heard that Mother God appeared just now? Yes, she also left behind 2 sentences. Heaven has long arms. The good will be rewarded with good, while the evil with evil. Heaven has long arms. Good, good. One hope all the bad people in the world can be brought to justice. Yes, it's just a matter of time. You're optimistic. Let's go. All right. Jiyu Chungrui replied and climbed into the carriage. After sitting down, he poured himself a cup of tea to warm his hands before briefly explaining what happened to Mrs. Kui. King Rui nodded after listening. The rest is up to you. If you need manpower, remember to let me know. 2 hours later, the capital knew that Mother God had manifested the saying that good and evil would be rewarded quickly spread. Even children who could not read could clearly repeat her words. However, those who had done something wrong began to tremble. They feared getting struck by lightning. When the emperor received the news, he laughed and said, good, good. With the intimidation of Mother God, some people should restrain themselves. He looked at Eunuch Li in a while, pass on my decree. Tomorrow, all the princes must go to the Mother God temple to offer incense and money. This servant will go and give the orders. After Eunuch Li finished speaking, he turned around and walked out. After he left, the emperor fell silent. He had done many bad things in the past few years and didn't know if Mother God would settle the score with him too. In short, many people had the same mentality, leading to the exceptionally exuberant incense offerings in the various Mother God temples. Jiyu Chungrui returned home and went to the study to find Ju Ying, who was practicing calligraphy in her room. Babe, thanks for the hard work. It's all right. I'll recover soon. Remember to send someone to the Yang residence to protect the siblings in case Yang Shicheng makes a move. Don't worry, I've already borrowed 4 men from King Rui. If anything really happens, they will act in time. That's good. By the way, shouldn't we recruit some men too? We shouldn't keep using other people's guards. We can't rush this. Everyone in the capital could be a spy, so we have to be careful about this. Lin Etienne and the other 3 have already started vetting candidates. Good. After Yang Wanning and her stuff are done, we'll head to the manor to stay there for some time. Chapter 560. A mockery. Why? Are you bored? Yeah, there's nothing to do. There aren't many people I can talk to in the capital. It's quite boring. All right, I'll bring them along for a short retreat. We'll come back after Yang Shicheng's problems are over. After the 2 had dinner, Ju Ying began to spread out her divine senses to look at Yang Wanning and her brother. Noticing that they were eating dinner, she went to Yang Shicheng and the others. They had already collected all the corpses, stored them in the mortuary, and planned to bury them tomorrow. Although there weren't many people on the streets, Ju Ying noticed everyone was gossiping about the Yang family. In particular, they were discussing Yang Shicheng. Some said that he persuaded Mrs. Kui to kill Mrs. Jiyu, some even said he had a part in the plot against Yang Wanning and her brother and that his goal was to take over the entirety of Mrs. Gus' dowry. However, there were also some who thought he was a fool and had been schemed against by his mother and wife. No matter what, he was in a disadvantageous position. The majority labeled him ungrateful and ruthless, while the rest questioned his ability. If he couldn't even know how to manage his family, how could he be an official in the government? Yang Shicheng and his party turned around a corner and bumped into a drunkard. After the drunkard recognized Yang Shicheng, he immediately mocked him, Minister of Revenue? What a fool. If you can't even see the people around you clearly, Why don't you go home and tend the farms instead? What do you know? Get up, get up. The butler pushed the drunkard away. I don't know anything, but you should. Could it be you really did conspire with Mrs. Kui to commit murder? You're looking for death. Yang Cheng-sen rushed over and punched him. The drunkard fell to the ground, but he still managed to kick Yang Cheng-sen. You must be the son of Mrs. Kui, ruthless as she is. Come, come, hit my head if you date. Yang Cheng-sen was so angry that he was trembling. He grabbed a stone from the roadside and wanted to throw it at the drunkard's head. Although Yang Shicheng wanted to kill this drunkard himself, he knew that his family could not afford to stir up any more trouble. He immediately grabbed Yang Chengsen's arm and said, "Stop, why are you bickering with a drunkard?" After saying that, he quickly dragged him forward. When the others saw this, they immediately chased after him. The drunkard pointed at their backs and shouted indignantly, "Who's a drunkard? I've never been drunk in my life." After saying that, he staggered away. After returning to the manor, Mrs. Ning saw that the manor was dark and barely anyone was walking around the courtyard. She quickly asked the butler to investigate what was going on. However, Yang Shicheng was not in the mood to deal with this. He returned to the house to wash up, ate a bite, and went back to sleep. After Mrs. Ning returned to her room, she saw her daughter eating obediently at the table. She walked over and said, you naughty girl. Why didn't you wait for Mom to come back for dinner?" "No, Mom. Nanny brought the food here, so I couldn't hold back." "Mistress, the food was sent by young miss. She said she didn't know when you all would be back, so we should let the RU eat first." Mrs. Ning was surprised by that. She remembered how Yang Wanning had avenged Mrs. Jiu today and wondered if she was trying to rope them in. After all, Yang Wanyu and Yang Cheng-sen were more favored by Yang Shicheng. After what happened today, they had to rope in more people to stand by their side if they still wanted to gain a foothold in the residence. RU was the only child in the residence other than the two pairs of siblings. Did the young miss say anything else? Chapter 561 Morning 1. No, she just asked the kitchen to send food for young Missy. The nanny shook her head. "Oh." Mrs. Ning responded thoughtfully and asked the servants to prepare warm water and her dinner. After Ju Ying confirmed the young residents wouldn't cause more trouble, she brought Jiu Chungrui to her interspace to get busy. The next day, after breakfast, Ju Ying said to Jiu Chungrui before he left, "Rui, let's pause our plans for the manor. I think something will happen at the young residence today. Are you sure you want to support her?" Jiu Chungrui paused and asked. "Yeah, judging by her reaction yesterday, it's commendable. The main point is that she listened to our advice and didn't drag us down. On the other hand, Yang Chenglin is still a little arrogant. He still has more to learn. He has a good personality, but has been spoiled by Mrs. Kui Corporation a little too much. By the way, let me know in advance if there's any trouble. 111 go over directly. Oh, bring my aunt's dowry list over too. If we need it, it could save us the trouble of making another trip." "All right." Ju Ying nodded. After he left, she changed into dark-colored clothes and asked Shiju to buy some incense and food offerings. While waiting, she extended her divine senses to look at the young residents. Perhaps because they were tired from yesterday's commotion, everyone in the young residence had just started their day. Of course, the butler had already gathered the servants and led them, carrying shovels and firewood, to the cemetery to dig a burial pit. At the same time, he set up a simple mourning hall for those who came to mourn. After breakfast, Yang Shicheng gathered everyone together and distributed their linen clothes for mourning. He brought Yang Chenglin and Yang Cheng-sen to the front yard, sitting at the entrance of the mourning hall. Unfortunately, 2 hours had passed, and only the first prince and the Marquis of Dingan's servants had come. They each offered 100 taels of silver in condolences. No one else came. Ju Ying saw the time was almost right, so she brought Shiju over. After entering, she wrote down her condolences in an etiquette book and offered 100 taels of silver. After burning 3 incense sticks as prayer, she said to Yang Shicheng, "Uncle, my condolences." Yang Shicheng nodded lightly and did not reply. Yang Chenglin stood up and said, "Cousin-in-law, Why are you the only one here? Where's my brother Rui? He said he would come over after he's done with his work. He should be here soon. Is that so? Okay, 111 bring you to my sister. After young Chenglin finished speaking, he wanted to bring her to the back. It's better to let your mother Ning bring your cousin-in-law over. It isn't appropriate if someone comes later and you, the eldest grandson, aren't here. Yang Shicheng raised his head and said, No worries, you wait here. I'll go to the back to look for your sister myself. Ju Ying gave him a look, then went out and followed Mrs. Ning to the old madam's small courtyard. Seeing the women waiting inside, Ju Ying greeted them one by one. When she saw Yang Wanyu wasn't there, she deliberately asked Yang Waning, Oh, where's Yang Wanyu? She's supposed to be the main character today, isn't she? She said she's tired and would come out when it's time to set off. Yang Waning blinked and replied. She knew the real reason was that rumors and gossip about the Yang family had already spread throughout the capital this morning. Yang Wanyu, the daughter of Mrs. Kui, was the main target of everyone's gossip. Words such as hypocrisy, meanness, viciousness, and ruthlessness were all directed at her. Some even felt she was the continuation of Mrs. Kui's evil plans. She was in a worse spot than Ju Ying when the Jiyu family was in trouble. Some gossip even concluded that the first prince would break off her engagement soon, so Yang Wanyu couldn't bear it anymore and shut herself in. Chapter 562 Morning 2. Yeah, yesterday's incident was too much of a blow to her. Mrs. Ning handed Ju Ying a cup of tea. Thank you. Ju Ying nodded with a smile and took the teacup. Mrs. Zhao sneered and said, Isn't she just too ashamed to face others? There were no outsiders here, so there was no need to hide it. To be honest, if I were her, I would have killed myself from the shame. She would be in deep trouble from the mess Mrs. Kui left behind. Stop it. Mrs. Ning glared at her. Which part of it is wrong? Besides, Mrs. Kui harmed my unborn child, so it's already good that I'm not taking revenge. When Mrs. Ning heard this, she knew there was still resentment in Mrs. Zhao's heart. She did not try to persuade her but gave her a warning look. She then told young Waning, take care of your cousin-in-law. I'm going to the front. As soon as she left, young Waning offered, cousin-in-law, I'll bring you to a side room to rest. Ju Ying nodded and followed her to the side room. When Mrs. Zhao saw this, she also stood up. Since even the person who should be here the most isn't even here, one can't be bothered to mourn for my enemy. After saying that, she stood up and left. When Mrs. Zhong saw this, she got up and swept her eyes across the room. She laughed at the soft couch that the old madam often lay on and said, Madam, you have schemed your entire life, but in the end, you have lost everyone's favor. I'm curious if you regret it now. I think the young residence is about to topple. I wouldn't mind watching to its very end. Ju Ying, who was keeping tabs at the young residence, was surprised when she heard Mrs. Zhong's words. It seemed that she had a lot of grievances against the old madam. She seemed to be someone who understood the situation they were in. Ju Ying wondered what kind of story she had. However, seeing that she was harmless, Ju Ying had no intention of asking. After confirming that no one else was in the courtyard, she asked young Waning, What do you plan to do next? Do you think my father will chase us out of the house in anger if we don't attend Mrs. and Madame Kui's funeral? Yesterday, your cousin mentioned this to me. I think it's better for you to send them off. No matter how the Kui family and their extended family treated you, Madame Kui is still your grandmother. It might look bad on you if you are adamant about cutting your relationship with them and refusing to send them off. Moreover, all the evil deeds were attributed to Mrs. Kui. Although Madame Kui treated you badly on the surface, she never harmed you, right? Besides, you guys already fought yesterday, but Yang Shicheng didn't make things difficult for you, right? But I can't take this anymore. A little forbearance will preserve the plan. If it really doesn't work, make a fuss about the dowry. If he were to prepare a dowry for Yang Wanyu, it would be impossible for him not to touch your mother's dowry. Yang Waning's eyes lit up. Yes, my mother's dowry mustn't fall into the hands of the enemy's daughter. But with such a big problem related to the Kui family, Will King Hui still marry Wanyu? You should know that your father is on King Hui's side, right? Young Wanyu paused when she heard that. That's right. Based on the various signs in her previous life, her father should be one of the trusted aides of King Hui. Otherwise, he would not have been promoted so quickly. He definitely had something on King Hui. Even if it wasn't fatal, it was still something major. Therefore, as long as young Shicheng was still alive, Prince Hui would not give up on marrying young Wanyu unless it was absolutely necessary. Cousin-in-law, why do you think King Hui didn't do anything when my father went to prison? Maybe he doesn't dare to. I heard the emperor is in charge of the Kui family's affairs. Another reason is that he might still be useful. Chapter 563 Sever Relationship 1. After hearing that, young Wanning looked at her in surprise, and soon she laughed. That's right. The emperor was a person with many doubts. If someone did something under his nose, wouldn't that invite disaster? After that, the two women chatted for a while longer. They never imagined they wouldn't need to wait until young Wanyu's wedding, as a perfect opportunity presented itself for the siblings to sever their relationship with young Shicheng. Young Shicheng could not fall asleep at night as he lay on his bed, tossing and turning. In his mind, the scene of Mother God appearing at the execution ground in broad daylight kept flashing. This reminded him that before Mrs. Kui died, she kept nagging about Mrs. Jiyu asking for her life. Since the gods have appeared, ghosts should also exist, right? The more he thought about it, the more annoyed he was. He could not help but believe 80% of Mrs. Kui's words. Therefore, the next day, he asked the butler to find a rather famous Taoist priest, Ling Fengzi. He brought the priest directly to Mrs. Gus' grave and dug it up. He used blood threads, Dao talismans, and 99 soul-suppressing nails to nail Mrs. Gus' coffin firmly. Jiyu Chungrui found out after receiving a note from the spy he had sent to the young residents. He quickly went straight to King Rui and had someone inform the young siblings and Ju Ying. He then promptly rushed to Mrs. Gus' grave. On the way, when Ju Ying went down to buy some offerings, she deliberately found a young beggar and promised to give him 100 pounds of black flour if he could spread the news. When the group of people arrived at Mrs. Gus' grave, the Taoist priest was almost done with his work. Moreover, Ju Ying could tell that this Taoist priest was someone capable. The talisman he placed on the coffin really had a certain effect. Therefore, before she got off the carriage, he drew out Guard Chu's sword and rushed forward to chop the Taoist priest's hand. How dare you! After the Daoist priest dodged it, he tried to counterattack. Jiyu Chungrui came over and kicked him in the back. Stinky priest, are you courting death? He quickly pressed the Taoist priest to the ground. Yang Shicheng noticed the couple, and his face went pale. When he saw King Rui not far away, as well as young Wanning and her brother with a murderous expression, his legs went weak, and he nearly fell to the ground. When the butler saw this, he collapsed to the ground and trembled. Soon, young Wanning and her brother rushed over. They looked at young Shicheng with bloodshot eyes and shouted, "You are no longer our father." After that, young Wanning started kicking the butler. The butler turned around and wanted to run, but Guard Chu walked over and held him down. When young Wanning and her brother saw this, they punched and kicked him mercilessly. The one they wanted to hit the most was young Shicheng, but they could only vent their anger on the butler because of their status. However, when he saw their ruthlessness, young Shicheng knew what they were thinking. At this thought, a trace of viciousness flashed across his eyes. "Stop hitting me, stop it. This is master's intention. I'm just following orders." The butler could not take it anymore and immediately shouted. The Taoist priest, whom Jiyu Chungrui held down, immediately added, "I'm just doing as I'm paid. This matter has nothing to do with me accepting money for this. You're going against the heavens. Aren't you afraid of getting struck by lightning?" "I'm doing this to survive." The Taoist priest smiled bitterly. "I'll give you one chance. Remove the things on top of the coffin and don't damage the bones one bit." Chapter 564 Sever Relationship 2. No. It's impossible unless we change a coffin. The Taoist priest shook his head. When Zhu Ying saw this, she immediately took out a banknote worth 500 taels of silver and handed it to Guard Chu. "Sorry to trouble you, but can you help us make a trip and buy the best coffin you can?" "Mrs. Gu, you're too polite," Guard Chu said as he received the silver notes. "Be buy more joss paper." The Taoist priest raised his head and reminded him. Guard Chu shot him a cold glance and immediately turned around to leave. Yang Wanning and her brother were also tired. They stopped hitting the butler. They looked at Yang Shicheng with hatred. A moment later, Yang Wanning said, "Since my mother has no place in your heart, we won't force you any longer. Today, we siblings represent our mother's decision to separate from you. From now on, our surnames will be changed to Jiyu, and we will no longer be an eyesore to you." "Impossible. It was your mother who caused trouble." Without waiting for Yang Shicheng to finish, Yang Wanning laughed and said, "It seems Mrs. Kui has a high position in your heart. More than 10 years of being married, and the Jiyu family supported you all this time." 66 sets of dowry had supported the Yang family for more than a decade, but it was nothing compared to the rumors spat by Mrs. Kui. "You are really a good example of a husband." "I agree with this. Although the Jiyu family has declined, it's not to the extent that they can't afford to raise 2 children. From today onwards, my aunt and you are no longer husband and wife." Jiyu Chongrue echoed. "Yang Chenglin, what about you? Are you going to mess around with them too?" Yang Shicheng immediately looked at Yang Chenglin. He would never allow this divorce. Otherwise, the Yang family would collapse once the Jiyu family's dowry was taken away. "Who is messing around? You don't even respect my mother's corpse. Do you even treat me as your son? I'm innocent and easily deceived, but I'm not stupid." Yang Chenglin clenched his fists and questioned loudly. After shouting that, his tears fell. What happened during this period made him realize that his father had no intention of caring for them. He only cared about his benefits and his future. But Yang Chenglin never expected his father would not even let a dead person off for profit. If they had a conflict of interest in the future, his father would definitely abandon him. "This matter is non-negotiable. Do you want to deal with it yourself, or do you want to bring it to the authorities?" Jiyu Chongrue said. When Yang Shicheng turned to look at him again, his eyes were filled with killing intent. However, Jiyu Chongrue did not retreat. Instead, he looked at him coldly. About 15 minutes later, Yang Shicheng saw that he had no room for compromise. He snorted coldly and said, "I'll satisfy your request. However, this cemetery belongs to our Yang family. Since Mrs. Jiyu is no longer our Yang family's daughter-in-law, please move her away as soon as possible." "I have the same intention. I don't think my aunt wants to be buried with her enemy." Jiyu Chongrue looked at the Taoist priest and said, "Help us find a good place with good feng shui, and we'll forgive you. How about it?" "Okay." The Taoist priest nodded repeatedly. "If you dare do a shoddy job, we will ask Mother God to teach you a lesson." Zhu Ying added. When the Taoist priest heard the word Mother God, he immediately remembered the lightning on the execution ground. He couldn't help but shiver and nod repeatedly. Definitely. I'll give you a piece of advice. Don't do any more evil in this life. Otherwise, you might be whipped for the rest of your life." "Understood," the Taoist priest said, twitching his lips. After saying that, he immediately turned around and took a mat. He covered the coffin and pulled out the nails. After removing the nails, he went aside to look for the cemetery under Jiyu Chengrue's supervision. Chapter 565 Sever Relationship 3. When Guard Chu returned, Jiyu Chongrue and Zhu Ying had already settled the cemetery matter after buying a plot of land from the local village chief. After that, the Taoist priest helped move Mrs. Gus' grave. After arriving at the grave, Zhu Ying spread out her divine sense and scanned the cemetery's surroundings. Although she knew little about feng shui, she could see this was a good spot for Mrs. Gus' grave. At the very least, it didn't make her uncomfortable. After the burial, Yang Wanning and Yang Chenglin burned a large amount of joss paper and cried bitterly. After they were done, the group of people quickly returned to the capital. King Rui and the others went to the Yang residence, while Ju Ying took the opportunity to return home. After taking the list of dowries and some snacks, she asked Haitang to prepare a table of vegetarian food before returning to the young residence. When she arrived in the living room, she saw that everyone was there, so she placed the snacks on the table. She placed King Rui's favorite hawthorn snack before him and said, "Everyone, have this as a snack for now. We'll have a meal at our house later." Jiyu Chungrui got up and handed the dowry list to young Shicheng. "I'm sure over the years, other than the land and shops, there is nothing else left. We will not be calculative. You just need to return the land and shops." Young Shicheng heaved a sigh of relief, as he had bought a few properties during the disaster. Although the income wasn't much, he could at least maintain the expenses of the residence. He looked at the siblings and asked, "Are you really going to change your surname to Jiyu?" "Yes, you still have 3 children anyway, but my mother only has us." When Yang Wanning said this, her eyes flashed, and she added provocatively, "Of course, if no one cares for you when you're old, we'll help you take care of your old age." In her previous life, Yang Wanyu left her with no one to rely on in her previous life. In the end, she even killed her with her own hands. Yang Wanyu could forget about living a good life in this lifetime. Yang Wanning wanted Yang Wanyu to lose everything, bit by bit, and taste the despair of her previous life. Of course, she still acted professionally, making people think she was sincere in her offer. She had her own motives for saying this. She did not want King Rui to think that the siblings were ungrateful children. Yang Chenglin nodded as well. Yang Shicheng was so angry that he wanted to beat her up, but he had to admit that what she said made sense. Based on Yang Wanyu and Yang Chengsen's attitude toward him these 2 days, he knew he would not have a good life if he were cared for by them in his old age. It seemed he had to hurry up and have another 1 or 2 sons. Because Jiyu Chengrui's demands weren't too much, he quickly gave in. He took out all the title deeds from the shops belonging to the Jiyu family and happily wrote down a separation letter. Just as he was done, Yang Wanyu rushed in and yelled, "Father, you can't return the dowry to them. There are 2 manors and shops that are already mine. Don't mess around." Yang Shicheng glared at her. At the same time, Yang Wanning sneered. "Don't tell me you want to use my mother's dowry as your dowry. Where's your face?" Hearing her words, Yang Wanyu suddenly remembered the rumors from before. She went forward and tried clawing at her face. Seeing this, Yang Wanning did not stand still. She took a step to the right and grabbed her left wrist. She stepped forward and turned her toes to pin Yang Wanyu's leg. She pressed down hard on the crook of her leg. At the same time, she placed the back of her hand behind Yang Wanyu and pressed her down forcefully. It took a while to describe, but it happened in an instant. Before Yang Wanyu could react, she felt pain in her arms and legs. She knelt on the ground with a shocked expression. Yang Shicheng was shocked and quickly asked Yang Wanning, "When did you learn martial arts?" Chapter 566 Sever Relationship 4. I didn't go out of my way to learn it. I only followed my cousin-in-law to learn 2 moves for self-defense. Yang Wanning looked at Yang Wanyu and added, "I won't be making things difficult for you because we're related. But that doesn't mean one will ignore that you've harmed me every step of the way. That little bit of blood relationship can only go so far. In the future, we will no longer be related. If you dare harm me again, one won't be polite anymore." Yang Wanyu immediately looked at Yang Shicheng. However, Yang Shicheng was not happy about her either. If it weren't for her scheming about her dowry, the Yang family wouldn't have reached this point. Wanning is right. You should restrain your temper. Otherwise, you'll only cause more trouble in the future. Yang Wanyu looked at her father in disbelief. She did not dare to make a fuss. Instead, she looked at Yang Wanning unwillingly and spat, "Let me go." Yang Wanning did not make things difficult for her after hearing that. She simply stood up and retreated to the side. Without making a fuss, Yang Shicheng got up and brought Jiyu Chungrui and Yang Wanning to the government office to settle the rest of the procedures. Meanwhile, Ju Ying asked Chuanxi, Mrs. Sun, and Yang Chenglin's errand boy, Xiao Shu, to pack up the siblings' belongings. It was mainly their clothes, bedding, and personal belongings. They then pulled 2 big carts filled with stuff and returned to the Jiyu residence with King Rui. Everyone ate lunch once they returned to the Jiyu residence. After lunch, King Rui and Jiyu Chungrui went to work. Ju Ying arranged for the 2 siblings to stay in the side courtyard. Yang Wanning, no, Jiyu Wanning, quickly shook her head and said, "Cousin-in-law, we can just stay in the wing room and save some firewood. There is a lot of firewood here, so don't worry. Moreover, it is convenient for you to have your own courtyard if you have a friend coming over." Ju Ying shook her head and replied. Besides, she was not used to them hanging around. It would be better if they could leave her some personal space. "Sorry to trouble you, cousin-in-law." Jiyu Wanning did not insist, and she thanked her. Afterward, the siblings brought their luggage and servants to the side courtyard. Ju Ying sent a helper to help the siblings clean up and do rough work. After an entire afternoon, word spread that Yang Shicheng had hired a Taoist priest to bind Mrs. Gus' soul and that Jiyu Wanning and her brother had left the Yang family. Of course, most of everyone, especially the women, agreed with Jiyu Wanning and her brother's actions. They felt that Yang Shicheng had gone too far. Unfortunately, there were also some selfish people who felt that Yang Shicheng was right and that Jiyu Wanning and her brother were too stubborn. Ultimately, it was a mostly positive reaction regarding Jiyu Wanning and her brother. On the other hand, Yang Shicheng was furious when he heard the news. He did not expect that his secretive actions would spread. He didn't need to guess to know it had something to do with the Jiyu family. He now despised the couple. Regardless, he did not care about them for the time being. He quickly went straight to Mrs. Ning to discuss the matter of Yang Wanyu's dowry. He bought whatever was cheap and practical. He avoided anything expensive at all costs. As a result, despite the fact that they had prepared 40 sets of dowry, it cost less than 10,000 taels of silver. This included a small manor on approximately 200 acres of land and a small shop of roughly 20 square meters on the city's eastern outskirts. In the evening, Sun Miaoke finished her meal alone and went to check the accounts of her residence for the past few years. At this moment, Qing Dao came over with a cup of tea and said, "Consort, I heard that His Highness helped Yang Wanning break away from the Yang family today and move to the Jiyu residence." Chapter 567. Some thoughts. She has finally freed herself from a sea of suffering. Otherwise, she might not get anything in the end. Sun Miaoke stopped writing and spoke. "Aren't you jealous? She hasn't even married yet, and His Highness is already helping her so much." Qing Dao said indignantly. "Did someone say something to you?" Sun Miaoke asked. "No, I just feel wronged for you." Qing Dao shook her head. "Is His Highness mistreating me?" "No, but, Qing Dao, from the moment I decided to marry into this family, I knew I couldn't monopolize His Highness. To be honest, I'm already grateful for us being able to treat each other respectfully. As for Yang Wanning, honestly, she doesn't have much weight in His Highness' heart. The ones he really holds dear are the Jiyu couple. So in the future, over the years, you have heard of many fights between wives and consorts, but in the end, none of them live comfortably, no matter who wins or loses. For example, Mrs. Kui had successfully caused the death of Mrs. Jiyu, but what did she get in the end? Did Lord Yang save her with all his heart? It's obvious that even she wasn't that important in Lord Yang's heart. You saw my aunt clearly all these years. She is my uncle's wife and can bully the concubines at will. My uncle also respects her very much. However, my uncle will still marry a new girl every 2 or 3 years. Do you think she really is happy? No, she's bitter on the inside. It's just that her heart had been in pain too many times and had become numb. She had no choice but to only close one eye to this." Sunne Liaoke was in a daze as she said this. She continued, "But look at my father. For many years, my grandmother has brought up taking in concubines, and the officialdom even sent him many beauties. But he didn't want any of them. What does this mean? Whether a man is a playboy or not, it all depends on his intentions. As a woman, the most important thing we can do is try our best to give him a warm home and present her best side to him. At the same time, we must protect ourselves. The rest depends on the man. The key was not to give away your true feelings first. Otherwise, Your feelings might be mangled once you want to take them back. Of course, she did not dare to say this out loud. Otherwise, if word got out, she could forget about taking another step forward with His Highness in the future. Seeing that Sun Miaoke had thought it through clearly, Qingdao did not say anything else and obediently retreated. As for Sun Miaoke, she wasn't in the mood to write anymore. Because she did not know if she could keep her heart from wavering before the outstanding King Rui in the future. Would she become as ruthless and unscrupulous as the Empress or Mrs. Kui? On the other end, Zhu Ying waited for most of the residents to fall asleep before quietly leaving the house with Jiyu Chungrui. They went to a small courtyard north of the city and found the little beggar who had helped her spread Yang Shicheng's scandal during the day. She handed him the 100 pounds of black flour and said, "Guzi, hide these well. It should be enough for you to eat for a winter." Guzi looked at the big bag of black flour and asked with a troubled expression, "Sister, can you help me keep it and give us 10 pounds a month?" Reason: Uncle Chi, who protected us before, has left. A group of children like us can't guard this. How old is the oldest of you? Me. I'm 12 this year. At this moment, a young beggar walked over and replied. His eyes were fierce, like a wolf cub, and his footsteps were light. It was obvious that he had practiced some sort of martial art. You know martial arts? Jiyu Chengrui's eyes lit up. Chapter 568. Good seedling. Zhu Ying frowned because his body had a bloody aura when she saw him. There was an 80% chance he had taken someone's life previously. I know how to fight. Previously, Uncle Chi was afraid we would be bullied, so he taught us a set of fist techniques. The young man looked at Jiyu Chungrui and replied. In other words, all of you know martial arts? Yes, but some are good at it while others are average. What did the uncle you mentioned do before? Will he come back? What do you want? The young man looked at him warily and asked. Nothing special. We want to recruit some guards for our place, but I don't know what your standards are. Guards? Yes, guards. My uncle used to be an escort mercenary. After the disaster, he was trapped in the capital. Seeing that we were pitiful, he stayed behind to protect us. Some time ago, he said that he had received a new escort mission, so he returned to his hometown with some people. Jiyu Chungrui nodded thoughtfully and replied, I see. Do consider whether you want to continue being beggars or follow us. The young boy nodded and took out a bag. After putting in a small amount of black flour, he said, Sorry to trouble you, but I'll give you a reply at this time, 3 days later. Okay, but let me make it clear first. I only want someone with solid martial arts capabilities. After Jiyu Chungrui finished speaking, he picked up the bag of flour and left with Zhu Ying. After they were far away, Zhu Ying put away the bag and asked, Didn't you say that the situation in the capital is complicated? Aren't you afraid of being cheated? We can't give up eating because of fear of choking, right? That kid is a good seedling for practicing martial arts, so I want to try to recruit him. All right. You know what you're doing. However, I have to remind you that there's blood on his hands. Are you sure? I'm sure. It seems that we really have to investigate properly. Jiyu Chungrui nodded seriously. The next morning, Mingyu came over. Seeing that Jiyu Wanning was fine, she hurriedly went to train her female soldiers. Meanwhile, Yang Chenglin went back to the academy. Zhu Ying returned the 50,000 taels of silver to Jiyu Wanning and said, Since you've moved out of the wolf's lair, you can hold on to the money for yourself. Thank you, cousin-in-law. It just so happens that I want to buy a house for Chenglin. You've thought it through, but I think you should wait a little longer. Otherwise, if Yang Shicheng finds out that you have a lot of money in your hands, he might slander your reputation. Moreover, Chenglin is still young and will be living in the academy most of the time. It's better to let him live here if he needs to for a few more years. Chapter 569. Heading to the manor. The young beggar, Qi Feng, and 5 others were taken into the manor. However, after Lin Yitian and the rest did their investigations and tests, they only accepted Qi Feng and another person with good innate ability as guards. Biaozi took in 2 beggars as kitchen helpers. The remaining 2 were handed over to Ju Dasheng to run errands and do odd jobs. When they arrived at the manor, Jiyu Chungrui went straight to the fields while Ju Ying and Jiyu Wanning carried their luggage to a small courtyard. When they were almost settled, Widow Wu walked over and asked, "Madam, what do you want to eat for lunch? What's available?" Ju Ying thought for a moment and asked, "There are still 3 eggs left, along with some carrots and cabbages. Is Lord Chen also in the manor?" "Yes, he has been staying with 2 bailiffs at the shed to keep an eye on the vegetables." "They live in the shed?" "Yes, they're also eating their meals over there. Head Fang has persuaded them to come over more than once. However, they did not agree. They said that it was convenient to stay there and watch the shed. Moreover, it's warmer there." "All right. Take out all the ingredients, and I'll cook lunch while you help me." "Understood, I will go down and prepare the kitchen." Widow Wu turned around and walked away. "You want to invite Lord Chen and the other 2 for lunch?" Jiyu Wanning asked. "Yeah, they've been keeping an eye on the vegetable for us. Since we're here, we must show some respect in return." "I see. Let's cook together later. I can also learn a few moves from you." "No problem. Although you have servants to serve you, it's best if you learn 2 specialty dishes. When the time comes, you can cook for His Highness from time to time." Jiyu Wanning nodded shyly, and she deeply agreed with her words. After all, Yang Wanyu had snatched her husband away with a bowl of pear soup in her previous life. She had to learn more cooking from now on. "Let's go take a walk and stretch our muscles." Ju Ying smiled and led her out when she saw she had listened to her advice. First, she went to the shed and saw that the sweet potato seedlings had already begun to be planted. She took off her coat to help out Jiyu Chungrui. About an hour later, Ju Ying stood up and said to Jiyu Chungrui, "Rui, bring the 3 brothers to our house for lunch when it's noon." "Madam, there's no need." Halfway through Chen He's words, Jiyu Chungrui raised his hand to stop him. "Just give us this one. Let's have a good chat at noon about the problems you've encountered recently." "It's settled then. I'll return and cook now." After Ju Ying finished speaking, she left the shed. After coming out, she walked around the shed at the side. When she saw some small rapeseeds that were ready to be eaten, she picked a bunch and filled half a basket. After returning to the courtyard, Ju Ying handed it to Jiyu Wanning and said, "Take it to the kitchen and wash it. I'll go get something else." After saying that, Ju Ying returned to her room. After putting down her cloak, she went to her interspace to get a piece of cured meat, about 2 pounds of dried mushrooms, and a bag of black fungus mushrooms. When she returned to the kitchen, she saw the 2 women washing the vegetables. Ju Ying took a little of the 3 ingredients she brought and soaked them. She then checked the ingredients that Widow Wu had prepared. They were radishes, cabbages, some dried vegetables, and a bowl of black noodles. Ju Ying pondered for a moment and decided to use some bacon and dried hemp vegetables as well. Ju Ying started stir-frying the mushrooms, pickling the cabbages in vinegar, and stir-frying the eggs with black fungus mushrooms. She originally wanted to mix them with shredded radishes but had to change plans when there wasn't white sugar here. She stewed the radishes instead. Chapter 570 depends on his capabilities. After knowing what to cook, the 3 of them got busy. Around noon, the scrumptious dishes were served. Especially the dish filled with bacon and hemp vegetables. It was salty, fragrant, and very tempting just after smelling it. Jiyu Wanning couldn't help but eat one as soon as it was out of the pot. However, Widow was heart-ached as she looked at the oil can. Head Fang had found this piece of suet with great difficulty. She hadn't expected. After Ju Ying saw her expression, she just smiled and did not take it to heart. When treating a guest to a meal, she had to let the guest eat comfortably. Otherwise, she might as well not treat them. As for the oil, she could just go out and buy a pig in the afternoon or even take some out of her interspace. Sure enough, Chen He and the other 2 ate well and were extremely satisfied. Ju Ying couldn't even eat her fill. In the end, she could only take 2 buns from her interspace to eat. After the meal, they rested briefly before Widow Wu and Jiyu Wanning went to the shed to help. On the other hand, Ju Ying took Head Fang and went out to collect the pigs with an ox cart. After driving for an entire afternoon, they finally bought a pig that weighed more than 100 pounds in one of the villages. On the way back, Ju Ying asked, "Uncle Fang, do you have a successor in this manor?" Mrs. Ju, what do you mean by that? Head Fang was stunned for a moment before he turned his head and asked nervously, "Have you heard that we bought another manor?" "I heard, but that place, I heard it's a place that can't grow anything. As long as it can grow grass, it will be fine. Our idea is that that place will mainly engage in livestock farming and plant some fruits and vegetables for the restaurant to use in the future. I noticed that you're familiar with the surrounding manors, so I want you to go over and give it a try at managing our manor. As for this manor, it's already stable. As long as someone is keeping an eye on it, it will be fine as long as nothing goes wrong. Of course, I won't force you if you're unwilling." Head Fang went silent for a moment after hearing this. Ultimately, he nodded and replied, "I'll listen to Madam's arrangements. As long as you think I can take over the new manor, I'll go over." To be honest, anyone literate and stern enough could manage the current manor other than growing vegetables and farming crops. However, it was different in the new manor. From Ju Ying's words, the stuff they were planning for the new manor would be their restaurant's main source of income. Even selling the livestock elsewhere would earn them a lot of money, which would also increase his value. "All right, we can only start after spring. If there's no suitable person to take over your position, quickly train one. After spring, we will need to go over there and build some houses, cattle pens, sheep pens, and so on." "I understand. My eldest son has been managing the manor with me. Do you think he can do it?" "Whether he can do it or not, it depends on his capabilities. Let him manage it for some time and give him more practice." "All right. I'll start making arrangements when I get back." Later, Ju Ying asked him about the situation in the nearby manors. She was a little surprised when she learned that all the surrounding manors belonged to officials. What surprised her was that a manor under Yang Chenglin's name specialized in farming. However, the head of the manor had been a little dishonest in the past 2 days and had been selling their stuff. After returning home, Ju Ying ordered her help to slaughter the pigs as soon as possible. She then personally treated everyone in the manor to a meal of pork and vegetables. She later asked Head Fang to sell a portion of the meat to the people in the manor at a fair price. In the end, only 2 plates of pork ribs and a piece of suet were left. She handed them over to Widow Wu. After everyone left, Ju Ying told Jiyu Warning about the situation of the manor under Yang Chenglin's name and said, "In my opinion, you should hurry up and deal with it. At least, you should get rid of Mrs. Kui's men. Otherwise, it would be difficult to take it back from them after they ruin it." Chapter 571 Childbirth. I can't believe their gut. Jiyu Warning huffed angrily. It's not too late to take action. Moreover, since they started this, you can take the opportunity to establish your hold over them. Jiyu Cheng reminded her. That's true. I'll go over tomorrow. Okay, I'll ask Lin Etienne to accompany you. If the people there are unusable, you'd better sell them off quickly. I understand. Jiyu Warning nodded in agreement. The next morning, Lin Etienne accompanied Jiyu Warning and set off. However, they did not go directly to the manor. Instead, they went home to get the manor's head and his family's contracts. Lin Etienne brought the other 3 guards along as well. With their company, Jiyu Warning had no more worries. When they arrived at the manor, they reminded them who was in charge. When they realized that the head of the manor was unrelenting, they immediately checked the accounts and took back the money he had earned from selling livestock without permission. They then sold these people to the south of the country. She then appointed the manor's head that Mrs. Jiyu had chosen previously. Over the next few days, Jiyu Warning brought her people to the other 3 manors and checked the accounts. If there were any problems, she would replace the people there. Meanwhile, Ju Ying was helping to take care of the shed in the manor. With her joining in, Jiyu Chungrui wasn't as stressed and had more time to continue learning his medical skills. 5 days later, King Kang's consort, Ju Jiuying, gave birth to a baby girl in the early morning. It was only at night that she slowly woke up. Seeing that only Nanny Yu was in the room, she struggled to poke her head out and shouted, "Mrs. Yu. Mistress, you woke up. How do you feel now?" Mrs. Yu quickly walked over and asked. "I'm fine. I'm just hungry and want to eat something." "Okay, please wait for a moment. I'll warm up the porridge for you." After speaking, Mrs. Yu left and brought over a small bowl of red date millet porridge. "Mistress, hurry up and give it a sip." This had been cooking for the entire afternoon. Zhu Jiuying pushed it away and said, "It's too hot, so let's wait for a while." "Has His Highness been here?" "He did, and he brought some tonics over. After looking at Mistress, he left when he noticed you were asleep. He even told us to take good care of you, and if you need anything, just let him know." "Did he say anything about asking for a seal?" "No, he probably wanted to wait until you woke up." Mrs. Yu shook her head. "Oh." Zhu Jiuying also felt that what she said made sense, so she lay down and rested for a while before eating the porridge. After breakfast, her family came instead of King Kang the next morning. After sitting for a while, Mother Zhu told her a few things to take note of and went to see the baby. Zhu Jiaqing sat down and asked, "Sis, how do you feel?" "Fortunately, the birth went smoothly, and I didn't suffer much." Zhu Jiuying carefully looked at her face and said, "Good. There's no mark on your face. Of course, our father is the principle of medicine. Don't be happy too early. You have to be more careful in the future. By the way, I heard Mother is talking about your marriage. Is there anyone you like?" Zhu Jiaqing shook her head dejectedly. She was in a difficult situation. The good ones didn't fancy her, and the others were too lousy to be her husband. She was placed between a rock and a hard place. Thinking of this, she huffed indignantly, "It's all Zhu Ying's fault. If she hadn't caused me to lose face at the banquet, I would have become King Rui's consort long ago. I wouldn't have to be left at home to be picked and chosen." Zhu Jiuying was speechless. Although she wasn't there then, she knew of the incident afterward. To put it bluntly, Zhu Jiaqing was acting brainlessly. Her schemes failed, and she even got herself into trouble, ruining her reputation. Chapter 572 Uneasiness. Sister, you have to think of a way to help me get back at her. How do you want to do that? Anthing, I'm not having a good time, so she can forget about being comfortable. Zhu Jiaqing became listless when she said this. She told her sister how she tried to send a spy into the Jiyu residence but was rejected by Zhu Ying at a glance. Zhu Jiuying smiled and said, "You know how to use your brain but are still immature. So what if a servant girl successfully entered the Jiyu residence and climbed into Jiyu Chengru's bed? She was just a servant girl. At most, she would cause some trouble for her. If Zhu Ying wanted to get rid of her, it would be easy. Then what should we do? If I remember correctly, they have been married for more than 3 years, but there has been no news of Zhu Ying's pregnancy." "Right, I only noticed after you brought it up." Zhu Jiaqing's eyes lit up. "It's true. You got married a year later than her and already have a child, but there's no news of her pregnancy. Don't worry about this. I'll help you vent your anger later." "How?" "Secrets cannot be revealed," Zhu Jiuying said with a stern face. She knew Zhu Jiaqing was simply unable to hide a secret. If she leaked it, wouldn't her plans fail before she could implement them? Zhu Jiaqing still wanted to say something, but Mother Zhu walked over and said, "Your sister has just given birth and is tired. You'd better not bother her too much." She looked at Zhu Jiuying and added, "Your dad asked me to bring 2 herbal recipes over, and I gave them to Mrs. Yu. Take good care of yourself. We will come to see you in 2 days." After saying that, Mother Zhu pulled Zhu Jiaqing up. "Hurry up, let's go. Let your sister have a good rest." After saying that, she greeted Mrs. Yu goodbye as Mrs. Yu sent them out. When Mrs. Yu returned, she saw Zhu Jiuying still had her eyes wide open, so she asked, "Madam, do you want to eat something?" "There's no need. Hasn't His Highness been here yet?" "No, after His Highness left the morning court, he hasn't returned. I think something happened." "I see." Zhu Jiuying responded and closed her eyes. However, she felt a little uneasy. Ever since she deliberately fainted on the street, The number of times she saw His Highness could be counted on one hand. She didn't know if he was deliberately hiding from her or if he was really busy. Also, the princess consort would be married into the family after the new year, so Ju Joying did not have much time left. Thus, she had to regain her husband's favor quickly. Otherwise, she and her daughter would not have an easy time in the future. Ju Ying stayed at the manor for more than 10 days. Just as the first prince and young Wanyu were about to get married, the three finally returned to the capital with a cart of vegetables. There were bunches of rapeseed, spinach, and cabbage. After entering the capital, Jiyu Chungrui brought a basket of each into the palace. Ju Ying distributed the rest to Ju Huiming, King Rui, King En, and the Minister of Works. Later, she returned to her residence with Jiyu Wanning. On the other end, when the emperor found out that Jiyu Chungrui had come with vegetables, he immediately summoned him to his chambers. When he saw the green and juicy vegetables, he asked in surprise, "Are these really grown in the greenhouse?" "Of course. I just harvested them before returning to the capital, so they're still fresh. This is my reason for my visit." Jiyu Chungrui said. Good, good, good. The greenhouse vegetables are successful. In the future, our winter days will be much better. The emperor nodded repeatedly. He thought of something and asked, "Can you only grow these leafy vegetables?" "No. But leafy vegetables have a short growing period, so they can be eaten in about a month." Chapter 573 Dowry. That's true. Would the other vegetables be ready by the new year? Tough to say. If there's a possibility of early maturity, we can harvest them. However, they'll definitely be ready on the 15th of the first lunar month. The 15th is fine, it's an important festival. If you manage it well, it'll be a great achievement. This is my honor. If you have no other instructions, I will take my leave. Jiyu Chungrui said. Go. If there's anything, report it in time. The emperor nodded. After Jiyu Chungrui left, the emperor ordered eunuch Li to bring all the vegetables to the imperial kitchen. At dinner, he wanted to taste the quality of the vegetables and see if they differed from those grown near the hot springs. On the other end, Ju Ying had just returned home when the little beggar Guzi, renamed Chi Tong, ran out to welcome her, saying, "Madam, you're back. This servant will help you carry your luggage. All right, send the clothes to the main courtyard for Shizhu." Ju Ying smiled as she handed him the cloth bag she used to wrap her clothes. She later handed the remaining vegetables to Ju Dashing and the others. As she walked in, Ju Dashing whispered, "Chi Tong is quite smart and lively. If he's properly nurtured, he'll definitely be someone successful in the future." Ju Ying smiled and nodded. If it weren't for his intelligence, she wouldn't have chosen him to spread the news in the first place. Thinking of this, Ju Ying solemnly instructed Ju Dashing, "All the more you should teach him. Let him learn as much as possible. Also, you should teach the young ones how to read too. They might be useful in the future." Understood. Ju Dashing nodded in agreement. After dinner, Ju Ying asked, "Rui, what wedding gift do you think you're giving the first prince? He's marrying a consort, so we can't give him a gift according to King Rui's standards. I think it's better to give him a purple sand tea set. It's not expensive but it's practical. Let's go with that." Ju Ying nodded in agreement. If it weren't for making peace on the surface, she wouldn't even bother to go to the first prince's wedding, let alone give a congratulatory gift. After entering the interspace at night, Jiyu Chungrui returned to the villa to read some medical books after working on the grassland. Meanwhile, Ju Ying continued to deal with matters within the various mother god temples. They soon realized that the previous batch of fish, including the small fish in the river, had almost been fished out. It was clear how much meat the people lacked. As the fish in her interspace bred to their previous population, she left the eggs behind and distributed the remainder to severely malnourished areas via the Mother God Temple. She also released many wild ducks and even some wild duck eggs. After she was done, she checked on Yang Wanyu's dowry. Although it was enough for 66 sets, the items inside were of terrible quality. The total cost was definitely not more than 30,000 taels of silver. To be honest, this dowry was not bad for most women. But as a concubine's dowry, it was not presentable. When she saw this, she suddenly understood why young Wanyu had been staring at Mrs. Gus' dowry. Ju Ying then looked at the first prince's residence, but no joy was present. There was only a small courtyard with new furniture with the word congratulations pasted on it. Ju Ying did not know the rules of marrying a secondary consort here, so she did not think too much about it. Before she left, she heard Consort Hui and the servants talking about Ju Joying giving birth to a daughter. She immediately looked at the fourth prince's mansion. At this moment, the fourth prince was planning something with seventh Su, and Ju Ying overheard it. She learned that they were searching for evidence of Yang Shicheng's corruption. But so far, they had only learned a little information from Xiao Heng's actions and had not found any useful evidence. After a moment, seventh Su suggested, "Your Highness, what do you say we take advantage of Yang Wanyu's marriage and send people to sneak into the Yang residence to investigate?" Chapter 574 Unforgivable. This is indeed an opportunity. Just send one person in. Remember, you must be smart, and it doesn't matter if you succeed or not as long as you don't expose us. King Kang said solemnly. Roger that. Oh, right. Do I need to make a move at King Rui's consort? There's no hurry. We have to wait until Jiyu Wanning enters the residence. That way, it'll be better for us to act once they fight. Seventh Su smiled wickedly and didn't say anything else. Ju Ying also realized that the blood aura on Seventh Su's body was much thicker than before. This kid had done many bad things recently. It was unforgivable that he wanted to stir up trouble at King Rui's residence by using Jiyu Wanning. Therefore, Ju Ying stuck a lightning talisman on his body after he went out. Instantly, his hair was burned and emitted a pungent smell as his clothes caught fire. He twitched twice, rolled his eyes, and fell to the ground. Fortunately, he was rescued in time. When King Kang heard the lightning strike, he immediately ran out in fear. It was the middle of winter, so how could there be thunder? When he saw Seventh Su's miserable state, he could not help but shudder. He recalled the thunderbolt on the execution ground. Could it be another warning from Mother God? However, his father and eldest brother had done worse. Why would they be fine when Seventh Su? King Kang's eyes narrowed at the thought of this, and he suddenly recalled how he had framed his eldest brother's subordinates to slip his spies in. Could it be, after confirming that Seventh Su's life was not in danger, he heaved a sigh of relief and glanced at everyone else. No one is allowed to tell anyone about what happened today. Otherwise, I'll kill you without mercy. At this point, he looked at the butler and said, Uncle Hong, keep an eye on this matter. Yes, Your Highness. Butler Hong responded and immediately dismissed the others. King Kang had his trusted aide carry Seventh Su into the guest room before calling for the residence physician to treat him. Mrs. Yu rushed over as the doctor entered and said, Your Highness, the young miss is sick. Quickly get the doctor. Go away, King Kang replied unhappily. Mrs. Yu was stunned when she heard this. This was His Highness' first child. How could he? King Kang finally realized that it was his daughter who was ill. He then added in a gentler tone, Wait, the doctor is busy inside. Ah, yes. Mrs. Yu nodded and retreated aside. At the same time, she heaved a sigh of relief. It was fine as long as His Highness didn't hate the young miss. About an hour later, the doctor came out and said, Your Highness, the young master is now fine. He will just be in some pain, and he will recover in half a year. Half a year? Yes, the fastest. The burns on his body are not light. I'll entrust the young master to you. If there's any situation, report it to me immediately. Yes. The doctor replied. Just as he was about to return, Mother Yu shouted, Wait. King Kang paused before he remembered that his daughter was still sick. He hurriedly asked the doctor to bring his first aid kit over. After hesitating for a moment, he also followed them. After entering the house, he saw Ju Joying pacing around with the baby in her arms. The doctor went forward for a checkup. Not a big problem. It's just that her stomach is a little bloated from eating cold food. Feed her some warm water and gently rub her stomach. Be more careful in the future. It is cold outside now, so you must not expose the child to the cold wind. Also, tell the nanny to be careful and to wait for her body to warm up before feeding her. Chapter 575 Anger. Ju Joying glared at the nanny and said, "Did you hear that? Be more careful in the future. If there's a next time, I'll take your life. This servant will remember this. I will be careful in the future." The nanny immediately knelt and kowtowed. "All right, hurry up and carry her down to rub her stomach." Ju Joying gave the baby to her after saying that. She rubbed her sore shoulders and turned around to go back to bed. Seeing this, Mrs. Yu coughed dryly and said, "Madam, His Highness is here." "Really? Your Highness?" Ju Joying had just turned around when she saw him leaving. She immediately got up and ran after him. However, King Kang was no longer there when she lifted her curtains. She looked at Mrs. Yu with dissatisfaction and asked, "Mrs. Yu, why didn't you say so earlier?" At that time, everyone was worried about the young miss. "I forgot about it for a moment. Please punish me." Mrs. Yu knelt and asked for forgiveness. "Just be careful in the future." Ju Joying paused momentarily before asking, "What's going on? Why did you take so long to call the doctor over?" Mrs. Yu chased everyone out before whispering, "I heard that 7th young Master Su was struck by lightning. The doctor only came over after treating 7th young Master Su's injuries." Speaking of this, she remembered King Kang's reaction. She was a little disappointed with His Highness' attitude, but since her madam was still in confinement from childbirth, she could only keep her mouth shut. Ju Joying smiled. Being struck by lightning in the middle of winter, wasn't that a punishment from the heavens? At this thought, her expression froze and turned into a look of fear. She solemnly instructed, "Watch the servants in the courtyard. If anyone dares to spread the word, slap them until they shut up." "I understand. You may leave." Ju Joying went back to her bed and pondered. Could it be that King Kand was so busy that he didn't even have a chance to see her? But what were they busy with? Why would the heavens punish them? It seemed that she had to send a letter to her father to warn him. Ju Ying looked at Ju Joying's troubled face and pitied her a little. Ju Joying and King Kang were childhood friends, and their marriage was done voluntarily. But it seemed that there was exaggeration in this voluntary act. At the very least, Ju Joying wasn't living as happily as she had imagined. Ju Ying retreated and headed toward the palace. It was already late at night, but the emperor was still engrossed in approving many requests. Suddenly, he stared blankly at a memorial. "Li, do you still remember who oversaw the construction of the Xiao River 5 years ago? This old servant is stupid and really can't remember. I will go and search for it immediately." After saying that, Eunuch Li turned around, went to the side hall, and began searching through the various memorials. Needless to say, the many documents were arranged neatly and were easy to search through. Soon, he found a scroll and hurriedly handed it to the emperor. "Your Highness, we didn't send anyone to supervise the construction. It was supervised by the local officials after the imperial court allocated funds." The emperor took the memorial and opened it carefully to examine it. Sure enough, he did not send anyone down at the time, but the local officers were from the Marquis of Dingan's faction or the people of the eldest prince. Yang Shicheng and Lord Bai from the Ministry of Works were also responsible for this matter. "Is there any news from Xiao Heng over the past 2 days?" Since Chief Xiao accepted the mission, he rarely re-entered the palace and didn't send any useful news. "It looks like they are well hidden." After the emperor finished speaking, he threw the memorial on his table. Chapter 576b Worries. Ju Ying saw that the memorial had not been closed, so she immediately went forward to take a look. It was a memorial from the south asking for funds to strengthen the river embankment. Thinking back to the conversation, she suddenly understood why the emperor was angry. She glanced at the memorial, saw Yang Jicheng's name, and smiled. Yang Shicheng was not far from death. Should she push the emperor to act so Yang Shicheng won't cause any more trouble? There was also the first prince. He was one of the masterminds behind the deaths of her original body and Jiyu Chengruis' original body. Thinking of this, after the emperor fell asleep, she gave him another dream and told him about Yang Shicheng helping the first prince commit corruption. She also told him about the secret chamber in the Yang residence and the way to enter. After leaving, Zhu Ying returned the things she took from the secret chamber. She even returned the 100,000 taels of silver in the manner wholly intact. With this evidence, their doomsday would soon arrive. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, the emperor suddenly woke up with a head full of sweat. She was shocked by this and immediately left. Seeing it was getting late, she collected what she needed in her interspace and planted some corn. After she was done, she picked up a 5-pound watermelon and entered the villa. She sliced the watermelon and called Jiyu Chungrue down. "You've been reading for some time. Eat a piece of watermelon and take a rest." "Thanks, it's great that you thought of that." Jiyu Chungrue pulled her to sit down. He first handed her the middle piece before taking another piece and eating it. Zhu Ying looked at the watermelon in her hand and smiled. She lowered her head and started eating. After eating, Zhu Ying told him what she had seen and heard tonight and that she had returned Yang Shicheng's gold and silver. "Great. It's revenge for our bodies." Jiyu Chungrue laughed after hearing that. He then asked, "So the fourth prince has planted a spy in King Rui's residence? Isn't that normal? I'm sure King Rui has spies in the others' residences too." "That's true. If he didn't have some tricks up his sleeve, he probably wouldn't have lived until today. I just wonder what the fourth prince's goal is. From my experience watching royal dramas, the most effective way to provoke two women to fight is to do something regarding their children, especially involving sterilization medicine. It will definitely make the two women fight to the death." Jiyu Chungrue only sighed and said, "To put it bluntly, women and children are just sacrifices in politics." After saying that, he stood up and disposed of the melon skin. After that, they took a shower together and went out of the interspace to go to bed. When Zhu Ying woke up again, the capital was in an uproar. The Yang family had been raided, all the family members had been captured, and the servants had been sold. The first prince was punished by personally reinforcing the South River embankment using his private coffers. The Marquis of Dingan's younger brother, Sun Wenhao, was also arrested and imprisoned, and Lord Bai from the Ministry of Works was also implicated. For a moment, the atmosphere in the capital became tense again. After dinner, Zhu Ying was teaching Jiyu Wanning martial arts when she realized Jiyu Wanning was daydreaming. She went up and asked, "Something on your mind?" "I guess so. I really didn't expect my father to have embezzled so much money." Jiyu Wanning replied thoughtfully. In her previous life, even though Yang Shicheng also had his corruption exposed, they did not recover much of the stolen money. It seemed that it was all used up by those three women. The Kui family women lived a much more luxurious life, especially after Yang Wanyu married the first prince. Jiyu Wanning remembered that Yang Wanyu had said that the first prince doted on her by gifting them all those luxurious goods. Now that she thought about it, those weren't gifts from the first prince. Those were bought after Yang Shicheng finally dared to spend the embezzled money once the first prince gained power. At the thought of this, she felt aggrieved for her mother. Yang Shicheng's salary had been solely for his personal use for the past several years. Jiyu Wanning's mother never spent even a single penny he earned after marrying him. But her ending was. Chapter 577a full stop. Just when Zhu Ying thought that Jiyu Wanning had softened her heart, Jiyu Wanning suddenly said, "Good. The more corrupted, the worse his outcome will be. Yup, since there's no more relationship between you two siblings can just live your own lives." "That's right, I still have Chenglin." Jiyu Wanning smiled. Her previous life had already become a dream that could not be repeated, so she needed to grasp this life and live it well. There was no need to think about those unpleasant things anymore. After that, the two practiced some martial arts and went out to buy her dowry. At the same time, Zhu Ying was also thinking about what kind of dowry to prepare. In King Kang's imperial residence, his expression turned grave when he considered what happened to King Hui. He knew that the emperor supervised this matter, so it seemed that he had to be more careful in the future. Otherwise, he would also land in a terrible position. Yang Shicheng was beheaded 3 days later, and all his family members were exiled. Like the Jiyu family, the Bai family was raided and sent back to their hometown. Jiyu Wanning could not help but laugh. It would be impossible for Yang Wanyu to stand out now. At the same time, to relinquish the vengeance inside her, she brought Chuanxi over to take a look from afar. When she saw Yang Wanyu's miserable appearance with handcuffs and shackles on her body, she could not help but smile. She realized that only Yang Wanyu and her brother had no one sending them off or giving them clothes. She said happily to Chuanxi, "Let's go home and buy some meat. We'll have a good celebration tonight." "Oh, mistress, you aren't going to send them off?" "No need. It's enough to see her in a sorry state." Jiyu Wanning shook her head. As for sending them off, she would just be mocking her. There was really no need for that. If word got out, it would be detrimental to her reputation. When Chuanxi heard this, she quickly walked back with her. In the blink of an eye, more than half a month had passed. It was also the day of King Kang's daughter's 1-month-old birthday. The night before, King Kang walked in and said, "Imperial father has decided on the naming convention for the next generation of girls. It would start with Le." Mother gave the child the word Xin, which meant prosperity. From now on, she will be called Yang Lexin. Lexin, a lovely name with a good meaning. Zhu Jiuying said, "Your Highness, no matter what, our daughter is the first child of her generation. Shouldn't the emperor bequeath her a title or something? Who would be given a title at birth? Moreover, she was not his legitimate daughter. It was already good enough that the emperor remembered that there was such a person." Of course, he only said this inwardly and not out loud. Why not? Isn't Mingyu one of them? Moreover, she's not even the emperor's flesh and blood. King Kang turned around and said with disdain, "Your ambition is inflating. Remember that I was only conferred the title of king last year. As for Mingyu, she's a special case. Back then, when King An followed imperial father out of the palace, he helped block an arrow and almost lost his life. After consort An received the news, she gave birth prematurely and almost died with the baby. That was why Mingyu was given the title of princess. Do you think anyone can start at the top without any contributions?" Zhu Jiuying felt her heart beating fast under his gaze. She hugged his arm and replied coquettishly, "I want to fight more for my daughter. Since it's impossible, then I won't suggest it again in the future. It's good that you remember. Mother will be here tomorrow, so be careful when you speak. If you make her unhappy, neither you nor your daughter will have a good time." After King Kang finished speaking, he pulled his arm out and walked out. "Farewell, Your Highness." Zhu Jiuying bowed immediately. After he walked far away, she looked at Mrs. Yu with an aggrieved expression and asked, "Mrs. Yu, do you think His Highness has a change of heart?" Chapter 578 Reflection. This servant can't be sure either. It's possible that He's angry because of what you said before. At this point, Mrs. Yu hesitated and added, "Madam, I feel that you should try your best to serve His Highness and make him happy. As long as He's happy, there are many things that you don't need to ask for. In order to please you, he will give them to you. On the other hand, taking the initiative to ask would be counterproductive." Although Zhu Jiuying felt uncomfortable, she knew what she said made sense. Initially, she thought their relationship would never change, but over the past few months, she realized that he had changed. He had changed so much that she felt she was no different from any other woman to him. It seemed that she really had to reflect on herself. She could not imagine how they would live the rest of their lives if she lost favor. She said, "Mrs. Yu, prepare my bath. Prepare the clothes and accessories that I will wear tomorrow." "Yes, but your body is still weak. You must be careful not to hurt your body." "Understood. Go and prepare." On the day of Yang Lexin's full moon, the Jiyu residence was invited because they had sold the greenhouse vegetables to King Kang. Zhu Ying had no choice but to bring Jiyu Wanning to King Kang's residence. After registering the 100 taels as their gift, They took the initiative to drink tea in a corner. Then, the royal family members began to arrive one after another. At this moment, Ju Ying also discovered that King Kang had mainly invited royal family members. As for the ministers in the court, they were either relatives of the Marquis of Dingan or first-grade officials like Prime Minister Su or Grand Scholar Sunday. She was probably the only one of her kind who did not have an imperial mandate. When she saw this, she could not help but be on alert. Soon, Mrs. Sun sat down and said, "You must be Mrs. Gu. Madam Sun sure has a good memory. I didn't expect that you would still recognize a commoner after only meeting once. It's mainly because you're too beautiful. It's hard not to remember you. I'll take it as a compliment." Mrs. Sun was stunned for a moment and smiled. "It is a compliment. I heard that Lord Gus Greenhouse has begun to produce vegetables. Is that true?" "Yes, but there are only leafy vegetables now. They will appear at the banquet later." "That's great. I wonder if you can send some to my residence. I haven't eaten fresh vegetables in a long time." "No problem, but the quantity is limited. I'm afraid I can only let you have a taste. Just send as many as you can." Mrs. Sun nodded. At this moment, Consort An walked over. Madam Sun immediately stood up and went to chat with Jiyu Waning. What surprised Ju Ying was that Consort An also mentioned sending vegetables. "Don't you also grow vegetables in your hot spring manor?" Ju Ying asked in confusion. "How much can we plant? Besides, there are many owners of that manor. We barely get a share of the produce." "That's true, but there's a limit to what's grown in the greenhouse too. I'm afraid we can't give too many." "I understand. Please send over as many as you can." Following that, many more came asking for vegetables. Ju Ying finally understood what Ju Huiming meant. As long as the news was released, the vegetables would sell like hotcakes. However, she replied to all of them with the same thing and did not dare boast about her produce. Conversely, Mrs. Sun chatted with Jiyu Waning for a while. Seeing that she had a gentle personality and did not like to gossip too much, she finally heaved a sigh of relief. After all, the Jiyu couple were very close to King Rui. Now that Jiyu Waning had changed her surname, she could be considered a real member of the Jiyu family. If she had a stubborn personality, her daughter would not have an easy time in the future. Chapter 579 Jealous Soon, Sun Miaoke also arrived. Mrs. Sun exchanged a few more polite words with Jiyu Waning before going to look for her daughter. After a while, Ju Joying came in with her daughter in her arms. Mrs. Yu, Mother Ju, and Ju Jiaqing followed behind. When everyone saw that the baby had arrived, they immediately went forward and gave their small gifts. When it was Ju Ying's turn, she took out a small gold bracelet engraved with the word fortune and handed it to Mrs. Yu. "I hope Miss Lachine will be blessed in the future." "Thank you." Ju Joying laughed. After that, she took a serious look at Ju Ying. Although Ju Ying was dressed in the simplest clothes, she found her skin fair and supple. Her hair was black and luscious, indicating that she was living a very comfortable life. Ju Ying's eyes were clear, revealing tenacity and guile. She looked completely different from the Ju Ying back then. It was no wonder Ju Jiaqing had no advantage in her hands. At the same time, a sense of jealousy rose in her heart. Her status was clearly higher than Ju Ying's, and she was married into a better family. Yet, her life was not as comfortable as Ju Ying's. At this time, Ju Joying's mother and Ju Jiaqing, who were helping Ju Joying greet the others, also returned. Ju Ying smiled and nodded at Mother Ju, then turned around and left. Ju Jiaqing wanted to chase after her, but Mother Ju stopped her. Ju Ying was no longer the same person she was. Moreover, since the old madam had already clarified that they no longer had any relationship with each other, there was no need for them to find trouble. Although Ju Jiaqing was indignant, she didn't say anything else. Soon, Consort Shu arrived, and everyone hurriedly stood up and bowed. "Everyone, get up." After Consort Shu finished speaking, she turned around and hugged young Lachine, saying, "Ah, our little darling is awake. Look at those big, watery eyes. They are so beautiful." Indeed, this child's eyes are like yours. Ju Joying laughed. Oh, please. Consort Shu smiled. It's the truth. Your eyes are publicly recognized as the most beautiful of all. Ju Joying added. This child's face is similar to Joying's. She has a pair of dimples on her small oval face and looks so cute when she smiles. Mrs. Su stepped forward with a smile. When everyone heard this, they surrounded the child and praised her. Ju Ying saw this and quickly went to the side to continue drinking her tea. In the afternoon, after everyone had left, Ju Jiaqing looked at Mother Ju and asked, Mom, Ju Ying was so arrogant before. Why didn't you let me teach her a lesson? You're just too impulsive when you've suffered before. Besides, your grandmother has already helped us draw a clear line with her, so don't provoke her. Otherwise, when something happens, the ones who will lose face will be us. Indeed, you really have to change your personality. Besides, quarrels can't solve our problems, and you are only making yourself more angry. Ju Joying nodded in agreement. Moreover, she had already found the best way to vent her anger. She would destroy Ju Ying's happy life when the time was right. You should learn more from your sister. Otherwise, when you get married in the future, you'll suffer. Mother Ju chided her. You guys. I'm going to see La Xin. Seeing that none of them took her seriously, Ju Jiaqing snorted in dissatisfaction and ran out. Ju Joying shook her head and asked, Mother, is there any progress on her marriage? Why don't we just find a stable, honest, wealthy family for her? With her personality, she won't have a good life in the future if it isn't a family we can suppress. She might even bring trouble to our family. Chapter 580 Royal Family's Banquet. 1. Your father had the same idea. He said he has a subordinate who runs a pharmacy and comes from a good family. He wanted to discuss this matter once his subordinate came to the capital to deliver medicine in the spring. Mother Ju then asked, By the way, how are things on your side? His Highness doesn't mind that the baby is a daughter, right? Not really. That's good. Your mother has lived most of her life understanding one thing. Fighting for favor isn't to suppress other women, but to keep a man's heart. As long as his heart is still with you, you don't have to be afraid of anything. In the future, you should pay more attention to him, go along with him more, and give in sometimes. Don't blindly compete and win over others. Or else, you'll lose his heart like your mother. I will remember it. Ju Joying nodded. After that, the mother and daughter chatted more before Mother Ju brought Ju Jiaqing home. In the evening, Ju Ying told Jiyu Chungrui about the orders by the various families and asked, How are things on your side? If you don't have enough to sell to all of them, I can take some out of interspace to make up for it. Don't. I will harvest as much as I can. I will just send less to each family, or else if our harvest doesn't match, the people in the manor will be suspicious. But I won't bring any vegetables back to our residence. If you want to eat some, you need to tell me in advance, and I'll bring some over before shipping everything away. All right, hurry up and send them over. We can still plant another batch before the new year. Yeah. Jiyu Chungrui nodded. For the next 2 days, Jiyu Chungrui delivered vegetables to the various residences, including the Imperial Palace, and planted another batch of vegetables. Ju Ying continued teaching Jiyu Waning martial arts and helped her prepare her dowry. She would head to her manor or Yang Chenglin's manor when bored. She requested they keep some livestock cubs, especially pigs, in preparation for next year. In the blink of an eye, it was the end of the year, and they sold yet another batch of leafy vegetables. At the same time, Sun Hongliang sent someone to deliver a pig, 2 sheep, and a cow through King Rui's men. Ju Ying asked Lin Yitian to send half a pig to their manor after receiving the livestock. After Jiyu Chungrui found out that Ju Huaiming had returned to the capital, he invited him to spend the new year at his house every day except for the eve of the new year. As a result, Ju Huaiming gained more than 10 pounds in half a month. On the 15th, at the imperial family's Lantern Festival banquet, everyone was surprised to see him all fattened. Chapter 581 Royal Family's Banquet, 2. As soon as the three of them entered, a white-haired old woman said in a strange tone, "Hey, I sent this the second daughter of the Ju family, Ju Ying? I heard that she fell out with her family the moment she returned to the capital. No matter what, the Ju family raised you. You can't just ignore your family when your wings harden." Ju Ying turned her head to look at her after hearing that. She then ignored her after she noticed who it was. It was the Empress' second aunt, the great-aunt of the Lu family. Previously, because the Lu family had previously helped Prince Hui in his assassination attempt on Prince Rui, they had been grounded for 3 months. Ju Ying didn't expect them to be out so soon. However, looking at the murderous aura on her body, she must have killed many people. Seeing that she was ignoring her, Madame Lu immediately demanded angrily, "What, you don't even know how to respect the old and love the young? Are you worthy of that?" Ju Ying said with a cold glance. I'm already respecting you by ignoring you. Don't forget why you were grounded by the Emperor. Do you need me to help you spread the news?" Madame Lu was so angry that she trembled and pointed at her but could not say a word. Mingyu looked at the two of them and quickly said, "Let's go somewhere else." After saying that, she pulled them to the other side halls. "Tell me, do you still respect your elders? You're simply too condescending." Madame Lu pointed at their backs and shouted. However, everyone just casually responded with a few grunts to give the Empress face before ignoring her. After all, even the Ju family did not care about Ju Ying's situation. What grounds do they have to stick their hands into this? Besides, they wanted to buy more vegetables from the Jiyu family. If they offended Ju Ying, where else would they get their vegetables? Seeing this, Madame Lu was embarrassed and immediately stood up to leave. The moment she left, everyone started gossiping. Some said she used to bully others, while others began digging into her past and describing how she had stepped over corpses to rise from a concubine to her husband's official wife. Madame Lu, who was listening outside the halls, was so angry that she almost vomited blood. She quickly went to look for the Empress and her sister-in-law. On the other end, after Ju Ying and the others left, they did not go to the other side halls. Instead, they went outside to look at the lanterns. Although the sky was not dark, the colorful lanterns were still attractive. "Wow, that little white rabbit is so beautiful." Mingyu pointed at a lantern hanging on a plum blossom tree. "Yeah, it's very cute. It looks like she's stealing food." Jiyu Warning echoed. Ju Ying stepped forward and took a good look, admiring these crafts, especially the picture painted on them. With just a few simple strokes, these craftsmen had drawn a cute little rabbit on a delicate lantern. She asked, "Will there be more lanterns on the street outside tonight?" "I'm not too sure about that. Because of the disaster, there hasn't been a lantern festival for 2 years. "Oh, right, I heard that Qingshui town in Yunhe County had a fireworks festival." "Is that true?" Mingyu asked. "Yeah, I saw it once on the second day after I went back. It was very beautiful, but there was a sea of people at the festival. It was a pity that the fireworks were short-lived, unlike a lantern that could leave something behind." Ju Ying then gave them a detailed description of the festival. "Wow, it sounds beautiful and shocking. I'll go and take a look when the year is better," Mingyu said excitedly. "You're making me want to go too." Jiyu Warning echoed. "If there's a chance in the future, I'll treat you guys to a big meal and watch fireworks." "Yo, what are you girls talking about so happily?" At this moment, a curious voice came from not far away. "You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.